Welcome to Real People, Real Stories podcast. I'm Arena, your host, and today I'm presenting you another real life story. My guest is Julie Pham. Born in Vietnam and arriving in the United States as a refugee during the Old People era, Julie grew up navigating life between two cultures, shaping her identity in the bicultural household while building a part of her own. Her journey took her across countries and through many different chapters, from academia to community organizing, from running a Vietnamese newspaper to working in tech, and eventually starting her own business. In this episode, we talk about her life story, the experience of growing up between cultures, and the many turns that shaped her personal and professional path. Hello, Julie.
Hello, Renan. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Thank you so much for coming. Let's start. Can you take us back to the beginning and share what you know about your journey from Vietnam to the United States? How this happened?
Yes. So I don't remember it because I was only 2 months old at the time. And I will say, though, that it was in 1979, and my father was just released from a communist prison camp. And so he had been there for 3 years after the war ended in 1975. And so after he got out, he said, we need to leave. We need to leave Vietnam. And he told my mom. And so we were actually the first in the family to try to escape communist Vietnam. And you and I talked before the podcast of how should I be addressed in it. And I said by Julie, which is my English name. I actually have a Vietnamese name, which is Hoài Hương. And that means to remember one's country. And so my father knew that once we left Vietnam, that he didn't want to go back. And so, and just to give your audience a little bit of a history lesson, because I think a lot of people don't understand this, that there was this war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, between the communists in the north and democracy in the south. And so my father fought for the South Vietnamese military. And after the South Vietnamese lost, a lot of them were penalized by the North Vietnamese. And it was really difficult for the South Vietnamese to have freedom under the communist government. So that's why many people fled.
Okay, because I'm not so strong in the Vietnamese history. Mm-hmm. Which part of Vietnam has won?
Oh, yeah, so North Vietnam. So North Vietnam won. And so then they took over the rest of Vietnam. And so that's why there's a communist government today. So imagine if there's a North Korea and a South Korea. So imagine if North Korea took over South Korea and then it was one Korea, right? So that's what happened with Vietnam. North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, and now it is one communist Vietnam.
Oh.
And that's why that there's so many Vietnamese refugees. The refugees actually came from South Vietnam.
So after the regime has changed, they decided, okay, that's not so good for us, and they started to leave the country.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because for a lot of South Vietnamese, we thought we can't live under communism. And that was what the war was for, was to fight for the freedom of an independent South Vietnam.
And unfortunately, they lost.
Yes. And so, I mean, I lived in communist Vietnam as an adult. I went back to Vietnam to get my PhD in history. And so, I think of it as not so much unfortunate, it's just what happened. And because of that, that's how we came to the US. And so these things, history happens. And I'm a really big believer actually in not looking at history for the lessons of right or wrong, but to actually go, okay, there are just many different stories in history, and how do we learn and appreciate those different stories? And so yes, I got to, as an adult, when I was working on my history PhD, I got to go back to Vietnam, and I actually studied the communist government. So I feel like I can speak to different perspectives of the war: the South Vietnamese perspective, the North Vietnamese perspective, the American perspective.
Right. Mm-hmm. I know we are jumping ahead, but since we already touched the topic, you left Vietnam when you were 1 month old. Of course, you don't remember anything, but you grew up in other country on the stories that your parents told you. So how did it feel to go back to Vietnam as an adult?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Rana, that's a great question. It was really strange. I mean, also at the time, when I went back, I was 22, and I was just starting to learn Vietnamese again, because growing up in the US, I spoke Vietnamese at home until I was age 5. And then I spoke just only English while I was in school. And so I only started studying Vietnamese as in my early 20s. So you have to imagine that when I came back to Vietnam, I was also coming back as very much an American and very much someone who is struggling to speak in Vietnamese. And so that really affected um, my uh, my enjoyment, my experience there, because it was also a struggle of language and it was a struggle of communication. And so that first year, everything was really new and different. And my parents, after they left Vietnam, my parents never went back to Vietnam. And so for them, Vietnam represented this place of loss, their lost homeland. And so I was also thinking about what their experiences was. And so going back to Vietnam, I realized, wow, this is what they left behind. And it's so different. And I can see why that would be really painful to go back. And what I mean by that is, so for example, there's so much more of a family culture in Vietnam, and there's so much more night culture and just kind of a closeness that you don't have as much in the US. And so I can see how that was something that they lost, that sense of that part of the culture that they lost. But I will also say it was really hard for me because when I first came back, that was in 2002. And back then it was still unusual for overseas Vietnamese to go back to Vietnam. And I first lived in the north, so in Hanoi. And a lot of Vietnamese couldn't understand why I didn't speak Vietnamese fluently. And they were just like, your language should be in your blood. They have a term called mất gốc. It means to lose your roots. And so I was also just dealing with a lot of identity issues of just, am I American? Am I Vietnamese? And it was a big struggle. And then I could understand why my parents were afraid for me to go back to Vietnam. And I'm actually really proud of that first year that I lived there because I did become so much stronger. I mean, stronger in ways that I never imagined that I could be. And I realized that I grew up actually quite sheltered in the US, and living in Vietnam, in the US, it's just you're innocent until proven guilty. And in Vietnam, it's like the opposite. And people are constantly suspicious of one another. And they're suspicious of the state, of the communist state, because the communist state is also always monitoring people. I realized a lot of what I had taken for granted, a lot of the freedom of speech, the freedom of movement. So that first year, living in Vietnam was just, I was going through a lot of different experiences of just identity issues, of trying to in my own identity issues, and also how people were perceiving me too.
When you arrived to Vietnam as an adult and you grew up in the US, as you mentioned, with other culture, so when you came to Vietnam the first time in your life, did you felt as local in Vietnam?
I felt very much of a foreigner. I felt very American, like an American in Vietnam. And what was difficult was people would look at me and they would see someone who looks Vietnamese or who looks Asian, but they couldn't understand why I was different. So even the way that I walked and the way that I laughed and the way that how much space I would take up was not Vietnamese, because Americans just talk louder, we laugh louder, we walk faster, we move our bodies more. And so I felt
it's with more freedom.
And it's, we take up more space. And so there was just, I was considered different. And so actually, and also my Vietnamese was bad. And so there were times where I just felt so exhausted by people telling me how bad my Vietnamese was. I would say I'm Chinese or I'm Korean. And then they were like, oh, your Vietnamese is good. And because I like, there was times I'm just so tired of being beaten up and told how I'm not Vietnamese enough. And now I think it's different because there are a lot more foreigners there. But back then in the early 2000s, it was so strange. And people would also just, in Vietnam, people just stare. I would be in stores, people just literally in restaurants, and people just stare at each other, and it's not considered rude. And so, there's just a lot of scrutiny as well. And then there, I want to say that there were beautiful parts too, because there's a lot more closeness in terms of family and in terms of neighbors. I mean, it was strange because my neighbors would just come by unannounced and just want to hang out. In the US, you have to call first. You don't just drop by, or at least like in big cities, right? You plan those things. And so it was, at first it was really strange, but then I got used to it and I can see, oh, this is kind of nice. It's just being in a community together. It's super casual and informal, and we look out for each other. And so, but I definitely had to get used to a lot of different rules and unspoken rules. And that's even embedded in the language. So for example, in English, we say I'm sorry and thank you a lot. I'm sorry, like it's almost a form of politeness. But in Vietnamese, you don't say that because, for example, you don't say thank you because to say thank you means to make something almost transactional. Like you think I'm only helping you because you want me to say, because I'm expecting your thank you. And it's just like, we don't say thank you to one another because we should just help each other. We shouldn't, and to say thank you is too formal. And so those are the kinds of things I had to learn.
That's a lot. Although everything very interesting. Let's go back to your life in US. You mentioned that you grew up in the bicultural household. Biculture, you meant probably that at home you had Vietnamese influence, and outside of the home, in school and other social places, you encountered the US culture. That's what you mean, yeah?
Yes. And so, I mean, there's a lot more hierarchy in Vietnamese culture, and American culture is a lot more casual. So for example, I would never call my parents by their first names, but you can hear that in English. Some kids would call their parents by their first names, or when you go over to, if I go over to my friend's house, and then the parents would introduce themselves by their first name. And normally I would always say Mr. and Mrs., or I would say auntie, but I would never call an adult by their first name. So those are some differences that I would just need to adapt to. That, yeah, there are just some differences in formality. And also in Vietnamese, in the Vietnamese language, I'm only who I am in relationship to someone else. And what I mean by that is the way we use pronouns. I'm always thinking about my relationship. Am I speaking to someone who is younger or older than my parents? Am I speaking to someone who's younger or older than me? And that helps me understand how I refer to myself and how do I refer to them. Whereas in English, it's very flat. It's just we all go by our names.
Somebody you don't know, like you use the formal form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. But the thing is, there is a difference. It's just unspoken. So we still have to find out.
Yes, we covered a lot. Let's go then to your professional part. We already spoke that you studied in Vietnam. So after the study in Vietnam, you get back to US, and did you start your own business, or you went into tech, or
Mm-hmm.
what happened after you returned from Vietnam?
Yeah. And so I should actually say I did research in Vietnam, but actually my studies was in the UK.
Oh my God.
So that's where I got my PhD. So when I was in Vietnam, when I was in France, when I was in Germany, that was actually all to do research, but it wasn't to study there. And so then I came back to Seattle in 2008, and that's when I finished my PhD, and I decided to help my family run our Vietnamese newspaper. My parents started the first private Vietnamese newspaper in the Pacific Northwest, which is in the US. And so they had started that newspaper in 1986. It was a family newspaper. And I decided to leave academia, that I didn't want to be a professor anymore, and that I was going to learn business instead. And so that's when I started working at the newspaper. And that really gave me a solid business education, because running a small business, I had to learn how to sell. I had to learn how to build partnerships, how to do marketing, all of the things that you have to do in a business. That was actually, I'd say those 3 years that I worked at the newspaper were the best education I ever got, even more so than the PhD I got at Cambridge. It was the best life education that I ever got. And so I was there. My brother and I actually ended up buying half the newspaper from our parents. And so it wasn't just working in the family business, it was also ownership. It was also learning how to take out a loan, how to get revenue, and all make payroll, all of those things of running a business. And after 3 years, I decided that I didn't want to work at the newspaper anymore, because it's also very exhausting work. And also, this was the time when newspapers were dying around the world. This is 2008, 2009. The internet starts taking over, and people are getting their news in different ways. And you can see newspapers were dying. and I lived in Seattle, and Seattle is the home of Microsoft, of Amazon, of Expedia, like really big tech companies. And so that's when I decided, hey, I wanted to try to get into the tech industry. And that's how I moved into the tech industry. After that, I had friends who worked there who introduced me. And so I worked in the tech industry for about 9 years before I started my own company.
That's quite a story, and the part that took you through different countries and continents. Let me ask this. Why then you choose academia? Because everything started from your study. You probably finished university in US and then you decided I want to go into academia and study further to get my PhD. So did something influence you?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I went to Berkeley for my undergraduate, and there it's a very academic school. And I really fell in love with research, I'll say, and really in love with historical research. And part of this was also just luck, Rena, because when I graduated, it was 2001, and Cambridge University had just started a brand new scholarship funded by it was called the Gates Scholarship. So it was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Microsoft money. And that was a brand new scholarship. And I started to get interested in getting a PhD, and then that scholarship made it possible. And because if I wouldn't have pursued academia if I had to pay for it out of pocket, right? And I went straight from undergrad to grad. And so in a way, I'm good at this. And I think this is what I should continue to do. But I was 21 at the time. So I didn't really know. I just knew I was good at it. And so it took me until I was 29 to realize even though I'm good at something, that doesn't mean that I should do it for the rest of my life. I still love history. History as a study is still my favorite. It's what I realized though was I didn't want to be in the university anymore. And I wanted to be out in the real life and doing business because I felt like that was a lot more dynamic.
I do understand. You choose what's best for you, of course. Mm-hmm. Let me ask about your time in tech. You worked there for a few years. You decided to switch after your business in the newspaper. Did you like this new industry? Was it something that you enjoyed doing?
I am not actually going from history to technology is a big jump. And I like the people and I like the different ways of thinking, but I realized that I was not actually that interested in technology. And I really tried because I wanted to think of myself as someone who really embraced innovation. And I will say that technology is not just about the gadgets and the software, and it's actually about the people who work in the tech industry that makes it so special. So I spent 9 years in the tech industry, and the last 6 was actually at a nonprofit that advocated on behalf of the tech industry. And that's when I started to get, I call it my second real life PhD in organizational development. And that's when I started to see, how are tech people different? How do they think differently? How do people in government think differently? How do people in nonprofits think differently? How do people in other kinds of the private sector think differently? And that's what I got really interested in. It wasn't actually the technology itself.
When you left tech, what happened? Which path did you take then?
So that is when I decided to start my own company. And that was actually in the end of 2020, where the pandemic has started. And I realized that I was doing a lot of work around mobilizing collaboration between people working in different sectors, and that I could potentially take what I learned and apply that to just collaboration and helping organizations in general. Going back to my academic days, people own their own intellectual property. They write books, they own that. And so that's what I wanted. I realized that for me to own my work, I would need to start my own company.
If you look back, because your path was not straight, you changed a lot of things, you tried new things, you traveled. So if you look back with all this experience that you have gained up until now, would you do something different?
I think if anything, I would try to travel even more during those times in my 20s. But I don't think I would do anything less. Maybe it would be even more zigzaggy. But definitely not less. Not less. So, yeah.
So, okay, this answer opens door to a new question because I'm really curious, and I say it almost in every episode. I'm really curious. More zigzaggy. So, what else you will do then?
I mean, I wouldn't get another PhD, but I've always been really interested in behavioral economics. So maybe that there'd be some work in that. That would have been, if I didn't study history, it would have been behavioral economics. And maybe that'll come later on. So yeah.
So, well, it's definitely also interesting.
Another thing that if I could do it again, I would have done sales earlier. I would have probably been in a sales role earlier in my career. And I advise that for people now. It's just, what should they study? I'm like, get into a sales job. Because I mean, I learned how to sell when I worked at the newspaper, but by that point I was 29, 30. And so I wish I had done that earlier, because I think that sales is actually the best thing that you can learn in life.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I have friends who are just bank tellers, even like, wow, and they learn so much. And so it's just, when in my 20s, my jobs were as research assistants. I wish I had taken sales jobs instead.
Okay, interesting. You think it's something US related, or it can be applied to also other countries?
I think that the thing that we learn in sales isn't just good for business. I think that there's something about taking risk and being able to tell our stories and to communicate and to be able to read people. To read what their needs are, to try to listen to what their needs are, to ask questions. That is not just about making money. It's actually even just how do you be a good friend? So, how do you have good relationships? Yeah, I don't think it's just the US.
That's actually a very good answer. Before we finish, what's the one thing you'd like listeners to take away from today's conversation?
I don't think that there's any good or bad, or just what I was saying earlier, nothing in history is unfortunate. It happened and we learn from it. And so that anything that happens in our life is something that we get to learn from.
Thank you, Julie, for joining us, and everyone else, thanks for listening to Real People, Real Stories podcast. Join us next time for another episode.